Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 146 and it's titled I Bought a Commander Masters Pack and all I got was this lousy commander. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. And I do want to apologize in advance. I know my voice sounds a little bit froggy. I am currently battling a bit of a cold, so I apologize if that comes through in the video, but we're going to get through it no matter what. So with that being said, let's check out our random card of the week, which was actually voted on by viewers in the video where we opened a Commander Masters pack. And if you haven't seen that, it was a short that was posted on the channel a little while ago. But the card that was picked was Kaho Minamo Historian. And Kaho is 2 blue for a 2/2 legendary creature human wizard. When Kaho Minamo Historian enters the battlefield, search your library for up to 3 instant cards, exile them, then shuffle. X, tap. You may cast a spell with mana value X from among cards exiled with Kaho without paying its mana cost. So, obviously, since Kaho is our random card of the week, she is also going to be our commander this week. And normally, I wait until the end of the video to reveal the deck's price, and I'm still technically going to do that, but I want to let you know of a bit of a challenge that I set myself with this deck, because I realized Kaho is only 6 cents, and I started putting cards in here, and the deck was actually very cheap. So I wanted to set myself a challenge to see if I could make this entire deck cost less than the pack of Commander Masters that I bought to get Kaho in the first place, which, if I'm being perfectly honest, was about $15. So if we can have Kaho be less than $15, we've hit the goal of having the entire deck be less than a Commander Masters pack, which I'm not saying you should buy this deck instead of a Commander Masters pack, but I'm also not saying that. So with that being said, let's jump into some of our themes, and then at the end of it, we will see if we hit our goal, and we'll see how much we may have either surpassed it or gone under that goal. But of course, themes first. The first major theme of the deck is actually going to be Infect, which I know sounds a little bit crazy, because we are playing a mono blue deck, and especially because we're trying to make a very cheap deck. But hear me out on this one. Prologue to Phyresis is the only Infect card in the entire deck. This is technically what we are fully built around. Our main goal is to give our opponents a counter, a poison counter specifically, with Prologue to Phyresis, and then use that to win the game. So Prologue to Phyresis is 1 in a blue for an instant. Each opponent gets a poison counter, draw a card. Since we can get any card out of our deck as long as it's an instant, with Kaho, we can actually get Prologue to Phyresis as early as turn 4, maybe earlier if we can ramp a little bit, but we're going to assume turn 4. We cast it on turn 5, and that's going to lead directly into our next theme, which is going to be Proliferate. We have no other way of giving our opponents Infect counters in this entire deck other than Prologue to Phyresis, so we need to proliferate them. And to do that, we're going to use cards like Steady Progress, which is 2 in a blue for an instant, it says Proliferate, and draw a card. Again, a card that we can search up with Kaho because it's an instant. Now, being able to get to 10 poison counters on each opponent is going to be incredibly tricky, so we do need to make sure that we have other things going on in the deck as well, which is where theme number 3 comes in, which is going to be Arcane. Most Arcane spells are a little bit overcosted for what we're trying to use them for, but if we can splice them, then we have a way of tutoring up cards with Kaho. For example, we could tutor up Evermind and then cast it for 0 with Kaho, which is a very unique synergy on its own, since it has no mana cost. But we can also, because it's an instant that has Arcane, we can splice onto Arcane, which means we can pay 1 in a blue, and as we cast an Arcane spell, we can reveal this card from our hand, pay the splice cost, and then add that card's effects to that spell, which simply says, draw a card. Now, using that, we have a deck full of Arcane synergies, which again, are a little bit overcosted a lot of times for what they do, but they're going to be very efficient for our deck because we can tutor up whatever we need at any given time as long as it is an instant. So that gives us access to Prologue to Phyresis, that gives us access to our Proliferate, that gives us access to our Arcanes and draw a card and counter spells and anything else that we need. So that is going to be our major goal of this deck, is essentially to just poison out the table with a little bit of card draw and counterspell backup. So with that being said, let's take a look at some of our key cards and see what exactly we're trying to do with this strange deck that we've put together. So the first of our key cards is going to be Sire of the Storm. And Sire of the Storm is 4 blue for a 3/3 spirit. It's got flying. Whenever you cast a spirit or arcane spell, you may draw a card. So if we are going to be casting a ton of arcane spells, and I'll be perfectly honest, we don't have a ton of spirits, but if we're casting arcane spells, then we can draw a ton of cards, and Sire of the Storm is a great way to refill our hand when we start to run out of gas, especially because we can use Kaho to get 3 arcane spells out of our deck, which technically do not go to our hand. We're not spending any resources to get those cards, but we can then still cast them and still get the card draw from Sire of the Storm, which essentially is like drawing 3 cards, but it's a little bit slower because we can only do it once per turn. Either way, still a very powerful card. Next up, we have Ghostly Flicker. Now, we don't have a ton of flicker effects in the deck, so Ghostly Flicker is one of the best, and I'm not going to go into the infinite combo between Ghostly Flicker and Narumeha. If you're interested in that, you can check out last week's video where I did mention that in our cool interactions section of the deck. Yes, that is in this deck as well, which I know is pretty impressive considering we tried to make it as cheap as possible. We do still have an infinite combo. That's a big reason why I'm a fan of it. But Ghostly Flicker is a great way to reset Kaho, because Kaho triggers on Enter the Battlefield. If we run out of the cards that are exiled with Kaho, we can just flicker Kaho, get her back, and then get 3 more cards. So typically what I will do playing this deck is I will take 2 other cards, typically Prologue to Phyresis and something else, and then the third card would be Ghostly Flicker, so that way the first time I've cast Kaho, I can immediately Ghostly Flicker to get Kaho back and get 3 more cards. Now, that's not always going to be what you want to do. You might want to use it to save some things. You might want to use it, like I said, for the infinite combo with Narumeha, but either way, it's a very powerful card and does a lot of what we want it to do in the deck. And finally, our last key card is going to be Flux Channeler, one of the most efficient proliferate spells in the entire deck. If you can get Prologue to Phyresis early and get everybody to have a poison counter early, Flux Channeler can end the game in a matter of a few turns. Because Flux Channeler is 2 and a blue for a 2/2 human wizard. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, proliferate. This deck is full of non-creature spells. In fact, I think we only have about 7 creature spells in the entire deck, so Flux Channeler is really, really powerful when our main win condition is giving everybody poison counters. So I don't really have to explain too much why that's a powerful effect, but just in case you're worried, we've got counter spells, we've got draw cards, we've got protection cards like Ghostly Flicker, we've got plenty of things to be doing, and because Kaho searches out instants, almost all of them are instant speed. We can kind of just trigger Flux Channeler whenever we want, and our opponents are never going to be fully prepared for what we're capable of doing. Now, with all of that being said, those are our key cards. Let's jump into some cool interactions and see what kind of synergies we have to offer in this deck. So the first cool interaction that I would like to take a look at is between Commence the Endgame and Flow of Knowledge. So Commence the Endgame, a very powerful spell that is kind of our secondary win condition because we don't have a ton of other ways to win the game, but Commence the Endgame, 6 mana, instant, the spell can't be countered, draw 2 cards, then amass X, where X is the number of cards in your hand. Since we have so many instants in the deck and we have so many ways to draw cards, Commence the Endgame can make an absolutely massive zombie army token. And while that's not super great, it doesn't have any evasion, doesn't have any ways to get through damage, it's still a pretty decent win condition when our opponents don't have much else going on. And so what we're really going to do is combine that with Flow of Knowledge, which is 4 and a blue for an instant, draw a card for each island you control, then discard 2 cards. So worst case scenario, we're playing this on turn 5 when we have 5 islands in play. We draw 5, discard 2, so now we're up 3 cards. I guess technically only up 2 because we had to spend the flow of knowledge to get it, but you get where I'm coming from. That is incredibly perfect because it leads directly into commence the endgame at 6, so all we've got to do is draw our card for the turn, pass, cast commence the endgame, and now we have a giant zombie army. Plus, we draw 2 additional cards from commence the endgame. So really, these 2 just alone can draw us a bunch of cards that can probably draw us more cards, can counter things, can protect our stuff, can do whatever we want to be doing. So that is cool interaction number 1. And cool interaction number 2 is going to be between Teller of Tales and Eerie Procession. So Teller of Tales is 3 blue for a 3/3 spirit. It's got flying. Whenever you play a spirit or arcane spell, tap or untap target creature. Then we have Eerie Procession, which is 2 and a blue for a sorcery. It's arcane. Search your library for an arcane card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. One of the nice things about Eerie Procession is that because we're playing so many arcane spells, this gets quite a bit of cards out of our deck, and Teller of Tales is going to trigger on anything that it gets. But the most important part of Teller of Tales, and why I wanted to highlight these 2 cards in particular, is that Teller of Tales can tap or untap target creature. We can use Kaho to cast an arcane spell, then trigger Teller of Tales, which will untap Kaho. We can tap Kaho again to cast another one, untap her again, cast the third one, and we can cast all 3 spells underneath Kaho in one turn if they're all arcane. And Eerie Procession can let us start that chain by being the first arcane spell that we cast if we really don't have 3 of them under Kaho. Now, obviously, Eerie Procession is not an instant, so it cannot be tutored up with Kaho, but it allows us to get any other arcane card, so that at least highlights why it's here. I could have put any other arcane spell in this cool interactions because I really wanted to just kind of talk about Teller of Tales, but I wanted to kind of show some of the synergies that this deck has. So that then is the end of our cool interactions, and now we come to the actual price of the deck. So as I mentioned earlier, I tried to make this entire deck cost less than a single pack of Commander Masters, which when I purchased the pack was about $15, and the total price of this deck came out to $13.83. So if you're looking to purchase either a Commander Masters pack in the hopes that you could get the incredibly powerful Kaho Minamo Historian, or you want an entire Kaho Minamo Historian Commander deck, one of them is a little bit cheaper than the other. With that being said, we do of course still have to talk about our most expensive card in the deck, which is Experimental Augury. An Experimental Augury is 1 in a blue for an instant. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 into your hand, the rest on the bottom, then proliferate. And it's a little bit weird to think about the fact that our most expensive card is only 60 cents. It's also currently a standard legal card, which is a little bit odd, but still a very interesting card and does a lot of work in here because it's instant speed, it's pretty cheap, it lets us filter the top of our deck, and it lets us proliferate, so it does do everything we want to do. And I guess if you do need to trim the price a little bit, this drops it from about $13.83 to $13.23, which is a little better, but there's not really a ton of other cards that you could throw in here. I really struggled at the end to try to make a last couple of cuts to get it below the $15. So that is our deck. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. There's probably a ton of suggestions that I would have for out-of-budget upgrades, because if we're trying to break $15, there's easily cards we could throw in. So, for example, I had to cut my favorite card, Aetherize, because it was about $1, too expensive. But I don't want to highlight every single card that I could possibly put in this deck. I want to highlight just a couple. And the first one I want to talk about is going to be Flow of Ideas, which is 5 in a blue for a sorcery. Draw a card for each island you control. Simple, efficient, nice and easy, a massive 25 cents. And of course, if you're putting a card in, you got to take a card out. The card that I would take out here would be Ribbons of the Raike, which is 4 and a blue for a sorcery. It's arcane. Draw a card for each spirit you control. Now, I mentioned earlier we don't have a ton of spirits. I think we actually only have 2 or 3 in the entire deck. So Ribbons of the Raikei is not as good as I originally thought it was going to be when I put it in, because I had to take out a bunch of the spirits. So 5 mana, draw 3 is not that great, but a 6 mana, draw 6 plus is very powerful. So Flow of Ideas really takes the spot of very powerful card draw, and yeah, neither of them are instants, so Kaho can't get either of them. But if you're looking for a nice quality of life upgrade, I think Flow of Ideas would be a little bit better in the long run. Now, another quality of life upgrade, because it's, again, technically not an out-of-budget upgrade if our total budget limit is $100, but another card I would recommend putting in is Training Grounds. And if you've, again, got to put a card in, then you got to take a card out. And the card I would take out is Lifted by Clouds. So let's start with Lifted by Clouds, and then we'll move on to Training Grounds. Lifted by Clouds is 2 and a blue for an instant arcane, and all it says is target creature gains flying until the end of turn, and splice onto arcane for 1 and a blue. Unfortunately, because we don't have that many creatures, this isn't going to be very effective. And yeah, we might be able to get that giant zombie token, but that's just one card in the entire deck, so there's not always the guarantee we can get it. We could tutor it up with Kaho, but our main game plan is the Infect counters. So this isn't going to be what we really want to be spending our time doing. On the other hand, though, Training Ground, which recently got reprinted and is now only about $250, so it's not super expensive, but it did break the original set goal of less than 15 in my mind. Training Grounds is 1 blue for an enchantment. Activated abilities of creatures you control cost 2 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the mana in that cost to less than 1. So now, any card we're casting with Kaho is technically costing us 2 less. If we use Commence the Endgame, which is exiled with Kaho, normally we'd have to pay 6. Training Grounds says that technically that ability costs 2 less, meaning we only have to pay 4. Now, you can't reduce it to less than 1, so everything does have to cost at least 1 mana. It can't be free, but it is something to note, because turning a 6-drop into a 4-drop or a 5-drop into a 3-drop or whatever can really change the way the deck functions and make it much more efficient, because that means that some of the more expensive counterspells are now just 1 or 2 mana. That means the card draw effects go from being 5 mana down to 3, and all of a sudden everything just gets a lot smoother. So I do think Training Grounds is a great quality of life upgrade, if you don't mind making the deck a little bit more expensive than a Commander Masters pack. So with all of that being said, those are all of the upgrades I would suggest. And before we get into the game, because we of course have to see how this deck performs, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways you can support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. As always, you can find us on Twitter, Reddit, send us an email. Those are all great ways to reach out, as is liking the video and subscribing to the channel. But if you're looking to support us a little bit more directly, you can find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member, where you get a ton of awesome benefits, like access to the deck lists a week early, access to a Discord where we brew up the decks and also play the games. So if you've ever wanted to be on the channel, that's a great way to do it. You'll get a random card sent to you every single month. You'll also get the guarantee from me that any card you suggest will be turned into a video for the channel eventually. It might take me a while. I know some of my patrons can attest. I do work pretty far in advance, so I do apologize if it takes me a while, but I will get there eventually. As always, though, you can suggest cards in other ways. You can just post them here as a comment. You can send them to me on Twitter, on Reddit, email. I'm happy to take suggestions in all of those places. I can't promise I will turn them into videos, but I will, of course, do my best. So, if you would like to join all of our amazing patrons and channel members, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Patty Whack, and Richard, then check us out on Patreon or right here on YouTube. And with that little self-plug out of the way, let's check out our game for this week. So this week, we're going to be joined by 3 opponents. We're going to be facing Paul, who's playing Narset Enlightened Exile, Luke, who's playing God Eternal Oketra, and Cole, who's playing Carmen Cruel Skymarcher. So Narset here, being played by Paul in his first game on the channel, is a deck that he and Luke, who are brothers, so they kind of work together on some of this stuff. Took a list off of EDH Rec and took out all the cards that cost more than $1. So they've got Narset as the commander, and then everything else in the deck is either $1 or less, in the same way that Luke's Medomai deck was last week. So Narset has the ability to give everything prowess, so I imagine that Paul's going to be making a ton of tokens and casting a bunch of non-creature spells. There's probably a bunch of Talrand effects in there that I am a little bit concerned about, because we can typically handle 1 or 2 big creatures, but having an army of like 6/6s or 7/7s is really going to shut us down very quickly. So I think out of all of these decks, that is the one that I'm the most concerned about. Next up, though, we have Luke and his God Eternal Oketra deck, and this deck is going to be all about casting creatures, and I'm sure he's got plenty of ways to bounce his own creatures so he can keep recasting them and keep making more zombies, and I wouldn't be surprised if we get run over by zombies before the game ends. So this is another deck that I do have my eye on. I am a little bit concerned by it, but I don't think I'm quite as concerned as with Narset. And then finally, we have Cole and his Carmen deck. This is an aristocrat style deck, so whenever someone sacrifices a permanent, doesn't even have to be Cole, Carmen gets a counter, and then can reanimate something with mana value less than or equal to her power whenever she attacks. So I imagine he's got plenty of sacrifice synergies. He's probably going to be killing his own stuff for value to draw cards and drain out his opponent's life. A very powerful strategy, and again, one that I don't really know if we have a great answer to. So I'm very interested to see how this game goes. I'm interested to see how our $13 deck functions, but let me know down in the comments if there's any of these decks you think will be particularly challenging for us to face. Let me know if there's any cards you'd like to see turned into videos in the future. And with all of that being said, let's check it out. We'll see how we do, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Paul goes first, followed by Luke, myself, and then Cole. On Paul's first turn, he plays an island and casts Ponder, looking at the top 3 cards of his library, putting them back in any order, choosing to shuffle his library, then drawing a card. Luke plays a Plains. I play an island. Cole plays a Myriad Landscape. Paul plays a Temple of Enlightenment, scrying 1. Luke plays a Plains and casts Pearl Medallion, making all his white spells cost 1 less to cast. I play a Mishra's Factory, then cast Thrumming Bird, which proliferates when it deals combat damage to a player. Cole plays a Hidden Courtyard. Paul plays a Command Tower and casts Thought Vessel, gaining no maximum hand size, then also casts Swiftfoot Boots. Luke plays a Plains and casts Rumor Gatherer, letting him scry 1 when another creature enters under his control, and draw a card if it's the second time that his ability has resolved in a turn. I play an island and attack Luke for 1, not proliferating anything on damage. Then in my second main phase, I cast Distorted Curiosity, drawing 2 cards. Cole plays a Minas Morgul Dark Fortress, then casts his own Swiftfoot Boots. Paul plays a Plains and casts his commander Narset Enlightened Exile, giving all his creatures prowess, and lets Paul exile a non-creature, non-land card from a graveyard with mana value less than Narset's power when she attacks, copying it and casting it. He immediately equips her with Swiftfoot Boots, giving her haste and hexproof, then attacks me for 3, casting the Ponder from his graveyard, looking at the top 3 cards of his library, putting them back in any order, choosing to shuffle, then drawing a card. This also triggers prowess, so I take 4 damage. On Luke's turn, he plays a Plains, then casts his commander God Eternal Oketra, letting him make a 4/4 zombie token with Vigilance whenever he casts a creature spell. He also scries 1 with Rumor Gatherer, then attacks Paul for 2 with the Gatherer. I play a Riptide Laboratory and cast my commander Kaho Minamo Historian, searching my library for 3 instants, exiling them, and being able to tap her to cast one of the exiled spells. When she enters, I choose to exile Prologue to Phyresis, Experimental Augury, and Ghostly Flicker. Cole plays a Plains and sacrifices his Myriad Landscape to search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. Paul plays a Path of Ancestry and casts Monastery Mentor, making a 1/1 monk token with prowess whenever he casts a non-creature spell. He then casts Impact Tremors, doing 1 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters under his control. This also triggers prowess on his creatures, and he makes a monk token. Luke plays a Plains and casts Mondrak Glory Dominus, doubling the tokens he would create. This also makes a zombie token with Oketra and triggers Rumor Gatherer twice, scrying 1 and drawing a card. I play an island and activate Kaho, casting Prologue to Phyresis, drawing a card and giving each opponent a poison counter. Cole casts a Soul Ring, then casts his commander Carmen Cruel Skymarcher, getting a +1/+1 counter whenever a player sacrifices a permanent, then returns a permanent from his graveyard to the battlefield with mana value less than or equal to her power when she attacks. He equips her with Swiftfoot Boots, giving her haste and hexproof, then attacks Luke for 2 with Carmen, returning Myriad Landscape from his graveyard to the battlefield. Paul plays a Plains and casts Expressive Iteration, looking at the top 3 cards of his library, putting 1 card into his hand, 1 onto the bottom of his library, and exiling an island, being able to play it this turn. This also triggers Prowess, makes a monk, and triggers Impact Tremors, doing 1 damage to each opponent. After that, he casts Kenra Spell Spear, doing 1 damage to each opponent, and also casts Invasion of Segovia, choosing Cole to defend it, triggering Prowess, making a monk, making 2 1/1 Kraken tokens with Trample, and doing 3 damage to each opponent. He then attacks the invasion for 5 with Narset and a monk, transforming it into Sea Tyrant of Segovia, doing 1 damage to each opponent when it enters, giving his non-creature spells Convoke, and also untaps up to 4 creatures in his end step. The attack also lets him cast Expressive Iteration from his graveyard, triggering Prowess, making a monk, doing 1 damage to each opponent, looking at the top 3 cards of his library, putting 1 into his hand, exiling Boros Garrison, and putting another on the bottom of his library. Then in his end step, Paul untaps 4 creatures. Luke plays a Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, then attacks Paul for 14 with his entire board. Paul blocks each of Luke's creatures with a monk, killing the tokens but taking no damage. Then in Luke's second main phase, he casts Farewell, exiling all creatures, artifacts, and enchantments. In response, I activate Riptide Laboratory, returning Kaho to my hand. On my turn, I play an island and cast Commence the Endgame, drawing 2 cards and then amassing X, where X is the number of cards in my hand, which is 9. Cole plays an Isolated Chapel, then casts Skull Clamp. Paul plays a Temple of Triumph, scrying 1, then recasts his commander Narset. On Luke's turn, he casts a Keeper of the Accord, so in each end step he gets to make a 1/1 soldier token if that player controls more creatures than him, and search his library for a Plains, putting into play tapped if that player controls more lands than he does. He also casts an Endless Atlas, which can be activated to draw a card. On my turn, I play an island and cast a Mind Stone, then recast my commander Kaho, this time searching my library for Domineering Will, Fuel for the Cause, and Steady Progress, exiling them. After that, I move to combat, attacking Paul for 9 with my Amassed Army token. At the end of my turn, Luke searches his library for a Plains, putting into play tapped, and also makes a soldier token, since I control both more creatures and more lands than he does. Still at the end of turn, Cole casts Stinging Study, drawing 5 cards and losing 5 life, since his commander has a mana value of 5. On Cole's turn, he plays a volatile Fault, immediately sacrificing it to destroy Luke's Nykthos and letting him search his library for a basic land, putting it into play while Cole makes a treasure token. He then also casts a Twilight Prophet, getting the city's blessing and revealing the top card of his library in his upkeep, putting it into his hand, making each opponent lose life while he gains life equal to the card's mana value. He then equips the Prophet with the Skull Clamp, giving it +1/-1 and letting him draw 2 cards when it dies. Paul plays a Slayer's Stronghold and casts Talran Sky Summoner, making a 2/2 Drake token whenever he casts an instant or sorcery. He then casts Preordain, scrying 2, drawing a card and making a Drake, also triggering Prowess. He also casts Roar of Resistance, giving his creature tokens haste and letting him pay 2 whenever more of his creatures attack, giving creatures attacking his opponents +2/+0 until the end of turn. This also triggers Prowess. He then moves to combat, attacking Luke for 3 with a Drake and Cole for 5 with Narset. On attacks, he casts Preordain from his graveyard, again scrying 2, drawing a card, making a Drake, and triggering Prowess. This means that Luke takes 4, while Cole takes 6. At the end of turn, Luke searches his library for a Plains, putting it into play tapped, and makes a Soldier token since Paul controls both more lands and more creatures than Luke does. On Luke's turn, he plays a Plains and casts Sevinne's Reclamation, returning Pearl Medallion from his graveyard to the battlefield. After that, he recasts his commander Oketra, then moves to combat, attacking Paul for 3 with his Keeper of the Accord. On my turn, I play a Field of Ruin and cast Into Deep, enchanting Narset, turning her into a clue. In Cole's upkeep, he reveals Lotho Corrupt Sheriff with the Twilight Prophet, putting it into his hand, gaining 2 life, while each of his opponents lose 2 life. He then plays a Swamp and casts the Lotho Corrupt Sheriff, losing a life and making a treasure whenever a player casts their second spell each turn. Once that's resolved, he casts Cruel Celebrant, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life whenever a creature dies under his control. This also triggers Lotho, so Cole makes a treasure and loses a life. Paul plays an island and activates Slayer's Stronghold, giving one of his Drakes +2/+0 and Vigilance until the end of turn. He attacks Luke with the Drake for 4. Once that's done, he passes. On Luke's turn, he activates Endless Atlas, drawing a card, then casts Aviary Mechanic, making a zombie token and returning a land to his hand when it enters. He then casts True Conviction, giving all his creatures Double Strike and Lifelink. In response, I activate Kaho to cast Fuel for the Cause, countering the True Conviction and proliferating. Luke then plays a Plains, and notably though, even though the True Conviction doesn't resolve, it does still trigger Lotho, so Cole makes a treasure token and loses a life. Then, at the end of turn, I sacrifice my Mind Stone to draw a card. On my turn, I cast Kiora's Dambreaker, proliferating when it enters the battlefield. At the end of turn, Cole sacrifices his Myriad Landscape to search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. In Cole's upkeep, he reveals Skittering Invasion with a Twilight Prophet, making each opponent lose 7 life while he gains 7 and puts it into his hand. He also cast Archfiend of Despair, making each opponent lose life in each end step equal to the life they lost that turn. He moves to combat, attacking Luke for 3 with the Twilight Prophet, and before Cole can move to his end step, Paul casts Chaos Warp, making a Drake, shuffling the Archfiend of Despair back into Cole's library and letting him reveal the top card of his library, putting it into play if it's a permanent, but it's a Swords to Plowshares, so it stays on top. Then, at the end of Cole's turn, he controls more lands than Luke, so Luke searches his library for a Plains, putting it into play tapped. Still at the end of turn, Paul sacrifices his Narset Clue to draw a card and put his commander back into the command zone. On Paul's turn, he plays an Adakar Wastes and recasts his commander, Narset. On Luke's turn, he activates Endless Atlas to draw a card, then cast Cloudstone Curio, letting him return a permanent he controls to his hand when he plays a card that shares a type with it. He then plays a Plains and flashes back Savine's Reclamation, returning Rumor Gatherer and Nykthos Shrine to Nyx from his graveyard to the battlefield. This is also the second spell of the turn, so Cole makes a treasure and loses a life. Luke also triggers Cloudstone Curio, returning a Plains and the Aviary Mechanic to his hand. He then recasts the Aviary Mechanic, making a zombie, scrying 1, drawing a card, and returning Rumor Gatherer to his hand. Once that's resolved, he recasts the Rumor Gatherer, making another zombie token and returning Aviary Mechanic to his hand. He repeats this process, recasting the Aviary Mechanic, making another zombie, scrying 1, drawing a card, and returning Rumor Gatherer to his hand again. Now that he's out of mana, he moves to combat and attacks Cole for 9 with his 2 soldiers, the Keeper, and a zombie. On my turn, I simply untap and pass. In Cole's upkeep, he reveals Swords to Plowshares with the Twilight Prophet, gaining a life, making each opponent lose a life, putting it into his hand. He then equips the Skull Clamp to Lotho, giving him +1/-1, killing him, drawing 2 cards, triggering the Cool Celebrant, gaining a life, making each opponent lose a life. He also casts Skittering Invasion, making 5/0/1 Eldrazi spawn tokens that can sacrifice themselves to make a colorless mana. He casts Smothering Abomination, letting him draw a card whenever he sacrifices a creature, and forcing him to sacrifice a creature at his upkeep. He then sacrifices all 5 of his spawns, drawing 5 cards, making 5 colorless mana, gaining 5 life, and making each of his opponents lose 5 life. He then activates his Hidden Courtyard, discovering 4, so he reveals cards from the top of his library until he reveals a Lightning Greaves, casting it. He equips the Greaves to Smothering Abomination, giving it haste and Shroud. This lets him attack Luke for 4 in the air, knocking him out of the game. On Paul's turn, he casts a Boros Signet, triggering Prowess, then plays a Restless Bivouac, and casts a Boros Charm, making a Drake, triggering Prowess, giving one of his Drakes double strike until the end of turn, and attacks Cole with all of his Drakes, and attacks me with Narset, casting the Chaos Warp from his graveyard, shuffling Twilight Prophet into Cole's library, letting him put a High Market into play. This also triggers Prowess and makes him another Drake token. Still on attacks, he activates Roar of Resistance, giving his attacking creatures +2/+0. Before the damage, Cole casts a Swords to Plowshares, exiling Luke's Drake that has double strike, gaining Luke 7 life since it had 7 power, then Cole takes 19 damage while I block Narset with my army, killing Luke's commander. At the end of turn, I activate Kaho to cast Steady Progress, proliferating and drawing a card. I also cast Murmurs from Beyond, splicing onto Arcane to also cast Evermind, drawing a card, revealing the top 3 cards of my library, letting an opponent choose 1 to go to my hand and the other 2 to go to my graveyard. This lets Cole put an island into my hand and Flow of Knowledge and Mask of Avacyn into the graveyard. On my turn, I play an island and attack Paul for 17 with my army and the Dam Breaker. He blocks the army with a Drake, killing it and only taking 5. Then, in my second main phase, I cast Teller of Tales, tapping or untapping target creature whenever I cast a Spirit or Arcane spell. In Cole's upkeep, he's forced to sacrifice the Smothering Abomination, drawing a card, gaining a life, and making each opponent lose a life. He then recasts his commander Carmen, immediately equipping her with the Lightning Greaves to give her haste and Shroud. He also cast Entomb, searching his library for a card and putting it into his graveyard, which in this case is Pitiless Plunderer. He then re-equips Lightning Greaves to Cruel Celebrant, giving it haste and Shroud, equips the Skull Clamp to Carmen, giving her +1/-1, then re-equips her with the Greaves, once again giving her haste and Shroud. After that, he activates High Market, sacrificing Cruel Celebrant, gaining a total of 2 life, making each opponent lose a life, and putting a +1/+1 counter on Carmen. This lets him attack Paul for 4 with Carmen, returning Pitiless Plunderer from his graveyard to the battlefield, letting him make a treasure token whenever one of his creatures dies. On Paul's turn, he casts Murmuring Mystic, making a 1/1 bird token whenever he casts an instant or sorcery spell. He activates Slayer's Stronghold, giving one of his drakes +2/+0 in Vigilance until the end of turn, then attacks Cole with 3 drakes, activating Roar of Resistance, hitting him for 14 and knocking him out of the game. At the end of turn, I cast Serum Snare, returning Paul's untapped drake to his hand, and since it had a mana value of 3 or less, I also proliferate. On my turn, I cast Heed the Mists, tapping Paul's Murmuring Mystic and milling myself for 1, drawing cards equal to the mana value of the milled card, which is a Toils of Night and Day, so I draw 3. I then activate Mishra's Factory, turning it into a 2/2 creature, and this lets me attack Paul for 25 damage with all my creatures, so even when he blocks the army, he still takes 12, knocking him out, and winning me the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely not the ending I was expecting, and we did wind up winning, but unfortunately we didn't get the poison win like we were hoping. We kind of got the beatdown with the secondary backup plan with Commence the Endgame. But it was still very, very cool. We got a little bit lucky because I think we kind of were just left to pick up the pieces once everybody else beat the heck out of each other. So everyone's decks really functioned very well. We were proliferating, but we couldn't find a decent engine to keep proliferating, unfortunately. So we didn't quite have the game plan going, but the deck still felt very solid. It felt like it was doing things. It felt like it was hanging in there despite the fact that it was only about $14. So a ton of fun. Very impressed by this little thought process and idea that we had here. Otherwise, at the table, I guess moving around clockwise, we had Cole, who didn't get to do too much with Carmen, unfortunately. He definitely presented a threat, but I think it was mostly due to the Cruel Celebrant and the ability to draw cards, like the Twilight Prophet and things like that. So, very cool synergies for an Aristocrat's deck. Hopefully next time we see Carmen, she'll actually stick on the board a little bit longer. She got a little unlucky and taken out pretty quickly, but very interested to see what else she can do in the future. And then the Narset deck from Paul, also very impressive. There were so many tokens, and it's very, very cool to think that that power level of a deck can come from, well, a deck with no cards more than $1. So very, very sweet. Definitely a terrifying deck to play against. Giving everything prowess is a very quick way to just overrun the rest of the table. And then, of course, moving on to Luke, I think that if Luke had had just a turn or two more, he had set up quite the engine with Cloudstone Curio and a couple of bounce effects that he was able to draw multiple cards in a turn. He was able to make multiple zombies in a turn, and I think that he really was set up to go off on that next turn if he hadn't lost, so a very impressive showing by the Oketra deck. Every time I see Oketra in the command zone, it's just even more powerful than the last time I saw it. So very, very impressed. I hope everyone enjoyed the game. I know I certainly enjoyed playing it. If you did, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all in 2024 with some more amazing content. So thank you all so much for watching. Be ready in the next couple of weeks for a 2023 statistics wrap-up video. Looking forward to that, but thank you all so much for 2023, and I'll see you all next year, and I'll see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.